Hey everybody, Tim Parrish here for the Huntington Church of Christ. Welcome to Wednesday in the Word. Would you want to be remembered or known by the worst decision you ever made? You see, a lot of times we tend to do that with people in our own lives, people in history, people that we know or people that we read about. We tend to focus in on the worst mess they ever made. And we assume some things about them based on that. We assume that they are that person, and maybe we even just write them off, or we think of them always in some negative light. Well, I'm afraid that happens with a lot of characters in Scripture who have some dark moment, some bad decision, some weak space where the worst thing they did, or the most embarrassing thing, or the thing that they really did wrong is preserved for all time in the pages of Scripture. And a lot of times as we read about them or we think about them, that tends to be the part that jumps to the top or that's easy to remember. Not the good things or the noble things, but the terrible things. Well, I think that's true of our character study for this evening. Her name is Miriam. You might know her perhaps best as the sister of Moses, and there's probably already an incident in her life that you can recall that was not the best. It was not great. But I want to suggest to you that Miriam, as a prophetess of God, was in fact a great leader. A leader among women, yes, but a leader among the greater Hebrew people. And I think it's easy to say that she is part of a group of 5 women that had a direct impact on the actual existence of Moses, and I think one of the women who had an ongoing impact in the life and ministry of Moses. We find Miriam in our Bibles in the book of Exodus, and then we see a little more about her in the book of Numbers. And she shows up at a time when the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, are living in Egypt. Now, remember, in the end of the book of Genesis, they got to Egypt under very favorable circumstances. Joseph was the second in command to Pharaoh, and he had received an invitation from Pharaoh to bring his family there and settle them in the land of Goshen. And so they came and made their life in Egypt. And things were good. But time passed, and as so often happens, new leadership takes the reins of the empire, and nobody really thinks of Joseph as the hero anymore. And the next thing you know, this people that had been a people living among the Egyptians were seen as a threat to the Egyptians. And so the Pharaoh decided that he needed to exert a little bit of population control. And one of the measures that he put in place was to instruct all of the midwives who were helping Hebrew women have these babies to kill any baby boys that were born. Well, the Hebrew midwives, Scripture tells us, feared God and wouldn't do what the Pharaoh wanted them to do. And they came up with this story that these Hebrew women were so fast when it came to having babies that by the time the call went to the midwife couldn't get there in time. The baby was already born, and there was nothing they could do. Well, you and I know that not to be true, but 2 of those women are named for us, Shiphrah and Puah. And we don't really know anything about them otherwise, except they were 2 of the Hebrew midwives who were making sure that the baby boys of the Hebrew women were in fact living rather than being killed. Now, you see, the Pharaoh thought if he killed off all the boys, there wouldn't be any new Hebrew boys to marry the Hebrew girls, and so those Hebrew girls would have to marry Egyptians, and soon they would cease to be Hebrew, and everyone would be an Egyptian. Well, this plan wasn't working, and he began to, it seems, take some extreme measures to do that. But one of the babies who was spared during this time was a baby named Moses. Now, we also could give some credit to his mother, one of the other women in his life. Her name was Jochebed, and she and Moses' father Amram were direct descendants of Levi. And she would not allow her baby to be killed either. She hid him, and she made sure that he had a chance at least. But when the time comes that there is danger, she weaves a basket. She covers it in pitch so that it is watertight, and she puts Moses in that basket and floats him out into the Nile River. Well, that's when we first meet Miriam, Moses' older sister, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 years old at the time that Moses is born. Her name probably means something akin to bitterness, and it might have something to do with her mother being older when she was born, and perhaps it was not a pleasant experience. But Miriam stands by and watches, and that's where we see her begin to be a part of her brother's life. And then, of course, the other woman, the other one of the 5, was the daughter of Pharaoh, who happened to be at the river at the exact moment that this baby floats up crying. And there's this exchange that happens there where we see Miriam step up and really do a smart thing, a wise thing. Maybe it was the plan, or maybe this was just a part of her early gifting as a messenger from God. But I want to begin reading in verse number 5 of Exodus chapter 2. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. And when she opened it, she saw the child. Now we know this is baby Moses. She saw the child, and it was a baby boy, and behold, he was crying. And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then his sister, that's Miriam, his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a woman from among the Hebrew women to come and nurse the child for you?" So Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes, go ahead." And she went and called the child's mother. The Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I'll give you wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now think about this story and all of the coincidence. No, I think all of the providential working of God's plan is what comes into play here. And so here's baby Moses in a basket where his mother had put him after he had been spared by the midwives, perhaps even Shiphrah and Puah. The basket floats up to Pharaoh's daughter who can't bear to not save the baby. And Miriam has this great idea. Let me go get a woman to take care of that baby for you. Well, in our language, we would say a wet nurse. And so who does she go get? Jochebed, her mom, Moses' mom. And so Moses goes back home with his biological mother, sent there by his adopted mother, who paid his biological mother to nurse him and begin to raise him. We often hear about the potential influence that Moses' mom had in those first couple of years, those formative times. We're not exactly sure how long she might have nursed Moses. Maybe a couple of years, maybe 3 years, just depending on what the customs were at that time, and it's a little bit hard to determine that. But here you see these 5 women in a group are responsible for the actual physical survival of the guy named Moses. Now, we see Moses' story kind of pick up, and he really moves into the forefront, and we don't really see Miriam again until we come to Exodus chapter 15. Now, we know that during the time that Moses is there speaking to the Pharaoh, Miriam seems to be with him. Perhaps they've had some sort of reunion. Aaron is there. And it seems that they are, the 3 of them, together. Moses, the baby of the family. Aaron, probably about 3 years older. And Miriam, probably about 4 years older than Aaron. And we don't really know what role everybody played. There seems to be some kind of thing with Moses' speech, whether it's translation, whether it's some kind of impediment, whether it's just Moses is not a great public speaker. I'm not exactly sure what the relationship of Aaron to his brother is there, but nonetheless, we see that being a part of what's going on here. Well, eventually, the great Passover happens, and death visits Egypt in such a way that the Pharaoh sends the people away. No more has he sent them away under the leadership of Moses until he realizes this is a mistake. I'm going to punish them for what's happened. And so he sends his chariots and his military forces out to stop these people. Suddenly they're caught between Pharaoh's army on one side and the Red Sea on the other, exactly where God had led them, exactly where God wanted them to be. And then there is this marvelous deliverance that happens. The Red Sea opens, the people walk across. Oh, it's a great thing. And Pharaoh's armies try to pursue, and the sea closes. Oh, it's a great story showing that the people didn't escape, but that God actually delivered them. Now, when you come to Exodus chapter 15, you have Moses before the people, and Moses composes a poem, a song, and he shares this with the people. He kind of sings through his poem. Well, then you come to the end of that poem in chapter 15, around verse number 20. The end of this poem from Moses introduces us again to his sister Miriam. And Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, Moses' sister too, I don't know why she's only called Aaron's sister here, took the timbrel, probably something like a tambourine, in her hand. And all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dancing. And Miriam answered them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider he has hurled into the sea." And so there's this song of Miriam. There's this time where Miriam comes out and she leads at least a chorus of women, if not the entire Hebrew people, in this maybe second verse of Moses' song, in the chorus that would accompany the song. Sing to the Lord, the highly exalted one, because of what he's done here. So we see Miriam not afraid to lead. We see Miriam as, if I can use a modern expression, we see Miriam leading worship in whatever form this was. And while some of our worship today might not include dancing or tambourines, we certainly can see that Miriam, as a prophetess, is now speaking for God in front of the people and leading them in a song of praise for God's deliverance. So if you want to know what kind of person Miriam has become, think about where she was when we met her, when she was a young girl. Think of the years that have passed since, when she has lived as a slave in Egypt. But obvious here is that she has never let go of her faith in Yahweh. Her mother and father had continued to teach her of the one true God. It's no wonder that Moses ended up where he did, or Aaron either, but it's no wonder that Miriam is a strong figure, and we see her called a prophetess, a spokesperson for God, evoking some idea of inspiration. Exactly what that looks like, well, we may not know, but we know that she was a prophetess of God, and that here she is shouting joyful worship, and she's leading others as she does that, as she expresses her great joy over the deliverance of the Exodus. Well, the story of Moses continues, the story of the Hebrew people now wandering in the wilderness for the next 40 years. And really, we don't see much about Miriam during this particular time. In fact, there's almost nothing about her until we get over to Numbers chapter 12. And in Numbers chapter 12, we find this incident that sadly has become the identifying story of who she is. And this is often what we think of. And maybe we read some things into the text that aren't exactly there. But I want us to look and see, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 12, Numbers chapter 12, I want you to listen to what happens in this next chapter in the life of Miriam, Aaron, and Moses. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman who he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well?" And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any other man who was on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and to Miriam, "You three come out to the tent of meeting." So they came out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the doorway of the tent. And he called Aaron and Miriam. And when they had come forward, he said, "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth and openly, not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses?" So the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he departed. But when the cloud had withdrawn from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous, as white as snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam. Behold, she was leprous. And he said to Moses, "Oh, my Lord, I beg you, do not account this sin to us in which we've acted foolishly, in which we've sinned. Oh, don't let her be like one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes from his mother's womb." Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "O God, heal her, I pray." But Yahweh said to Moses, if her father had spit in her face, would she not bear her shame for 7 days? Let her be shut up for 7 days outside the camp. Afterwards she shall be received again. So Miriam was shut up outside the camp for 7 days, and the people didn't move on until Miriam was received again. And then we move on. Now, there's an incident right here that may or may not be what exactly we think. A lot of times this story is brought up as a great example of how God views racial discrimination or racism. And maybe that's appropriate. It may well be, even though the scriptures don't tell us, it may well be that this woman that Moses had married, probably from somewhere around Ethiopia, had very dark skin, darker than Moses' skin would have been. And maybe that was the objection. Maybe that was the problem, even though it's not specifically stated here. But it's equally possible that they're upset with Moses because rather than marrying a Hebrew woman, he's married anybody else. He's taken a wife from any other group of people than the Hebrew people, the descendants of Abraham. It may also be that there's some scholars, some rabbis who suggest that maybe this was really a question of polygamy and that they were upset with Moses for having more than one wife. Well, it's really hard to read the text and know exactly what's going on, except that Miriam and Aaron had a problem with Moses' leadership and Moses' marriage. And they both commented, but Miriam is the spokesperson here. Again, the bold one, not one to shrink behind, a leader among people, and one who has been named in Scripture as a prophet herself. And she kind of expresses a little jealousy almost. And she said, "Who made Moses the boss? Aaron and me? We're both prophets too. And God has spoken to Moses, but God speaks to us too. So why does Moses get to be the one who makes all of the decisions? And when Moses makes what we think is a bad decision, why won't anybody question Moses?" Now this story of what God does in response to this is amazing. It's terrifying. Can you imagine what it would be like to speak negatively against somebody and all of a sudden the voice of God himself calls you out and says, "Hey, come out here, we need to talk. Let's take this outside." Now that's one thing to hear it from a man or a woman, but to hear it from the heavens, from the voice in the mouth of the Creator. Now God explains to them, it seems, that yes, they are prophets, but that his means of communication, his relationship with Moses is different. That Moses is the one that he has appointed as the leader. It doesn't mean that they aren't also leaders. It doesn't mean that they aren't also prophets. But it does mean that they have acted inappropriately. In fact, Aaron calls it sin. He says, "We were foolish." And the mark, the evidence of this was that suddenly some skin disease was all over Miriam's body. Now, the question that comes from me is, why didn't Aaron get it too? Because he was a participant in this complaint. Maybe it was because Miriam led. Maybe it was because she was the spokesperson. It's a little hard to say exactly what was going on there. Nonetheless, Miriam has this skin problem, and it doesn't go away, and she doesn't get to come back into the assembly of the people for a week. For a week, she bore her shame. For a week, she bore not only the physical stigma of what was on her skin, but she also had to deal with the being cut off aspect. And so she had to face her sin, and she had to deal with it in a very real and open way. And what I really would like to see is what happened at the end of that 7 days. I'd like to see the time that she comes back. I'd like to see what conversations took place, even what her prayer life looked like in those in-between days. Unfortunately, we just don't get to see that. But what we've seen of Miriam up to this point doesn't suggest that Miriam is a shameful woman who doesn't know when to hold her tongue, that she's petty or that she's spiteful or that she's jealous. So while she may have acted in those ways, I don't want us to assume that that's who she was or that that's how she ought to be remembered. Now, we don't hear another word from Miriam. I mean, there's nothing else about her until we get to chapter 20. And then her story ends. Numbers chapter 20, beginning in verse 1. Then the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month. And the people stayed at Kadesh. And Miriam died there, and she was buried there. And that's Saul. Miriam died, and they buried her. I'm sure that was hard for Aaron and Moses to lose their sister, their partner, their fellow prophet. This was a real blow for the leadership among the people, for the leadership that she had shown, and probably for the example that she had become, good and bad, based on the things that had happened to her. It is interesting that water had kind of been a significant part of the beginning of their story together, being in the river. And water would be a significant part of the end of their life story together, because they're at a place in the wilderness where there isn't any water. Miriam dies, the water is not there, and the people assemble themselves, and they're ready to come after Moses and Aaron. Let's just go ahead and take out all three of those kids of Amram and Jochebed all at once. But of course it doesn't go that way, and water is given in a spring. The Lord gives them this water. And maybe there's a significance in the fact that this is the place that Miriam dies and then the water is given. I don't know if we can connect those in any theological way or not, but it's kind of neat that that's what happened next, that Miriam dies, but in that same instance, almost God provides life-giving water for the people. So what about Miriam? What do I want you to know about her? What lessons do I think we can learn about her? And how can we change the way maybe that we've thought about her? Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that she is called by God through inspiration a prophet. A prophet is someone who doesn't necessarily have to see the future. Some prophets foretell the future, but some forthtell. They speak about the present. They speak about the circumstances, what's going on. They have a message from God. I don't know what messages from God Miriam might have already been communicating to the people, or what she continued to say on behalf of Yahweh. No way to know that. But God called her a prophet. And prophets weren't normally people who had terrible lives or huge character flaws. So Miriam starts for us as someone who is a prophet. She is someone who is brave and courageous. I think we see that when she's standing on the riverbank watching her baby brother float in a basket. When she volunteers to do something a little bit risky by going and getting her mom, Moses' mom, to come and be the nursemaid for this baby. She was bold and she was brave. We even see that in the incident about her that's not so great, when she ends up leprous, because she saw something that she thought ought to be spoken about. She saw something that she believed needed to be brought to light, and she wasn't afraid, even if it was the wrong course to take, to speak about that. We also see that she is a leader. She is a leader in worship. She is a leader in life. Undoubtedly, many people looked to her as an example. Many people listened to her. You know, there were probably some people who had a hard time with Moses because Moses had been raised by Pharaoh. He'd been raised as an Egyptian. He had lived as Egyptian royalty. They probably identified a little bit more with both Aaron and Miriam because they had been raised the same as them, as Hebrew slaves, unwanted, rejected. So she was probably a voice of reason, a voice of vision, a voice of leadership for a lot of people. But I also want you to notice this about Miriam, and I think maybe this is one of the most important things, is that Miriam was normal. She was normal. What do I mean by that? Sometimes we see people in the narrative of Scripture, and the things that they do or the accomplishments that are recorded seem to be so huge and so amazing and so impressive, and we think, wow, you know, God used people like that, but God couldn't use somebody like me. Except Miriam was normal. And she got ahead of herself sometimes, and she didn't always get everything right. Sometimes she got it wrong. Sometimes she got it really wrong. At least one time she got it so wrong that God himself called her out by name and said, let me show you what I think about this wrong thing, this wrong attitude. So there's some things maybe about Miriam that weren't great. There is this one moment where she criticizes her brother and his leadership, his choice of wife. But as a general rule, we see a prophetic leader among God's people, a woman who praised God with her life and her words, and who I think, as a leader, as a prophet, and as a woman of God, is worthy of our praise today. I'd be interested to know what you think. Thanks for stopping by.